Well, hey everyone, thank you for listening to part one of the debate on Islam. Is it a violent religion or a peaceful religion? My name is Keith Giles, and I'll be one of the participants in the debate. And I'm joined by my friend and brother in Christ, Daryl Giles, even though Daryl and I have the same last name. And probably somewhere back there, we are related by blood in some fashion, I'm sure, but in a way he and I have not yet determined. We're not brothers in any way other than in Christ. And yet, what we wanted to do was to come together and have a debate and a discussion about this issue. Daryl will be taking the position that Islam is a violent religion. I'll be taking the position that Islam is a peaceful religion. And I'm just going to read quickly, Daryl, your bio here, just so people could kind of know who you are. Daryl Giles has been licensed and ordained as a minister of the gospel for over 15 years and enjoys preaching and teaching. Daryl is a pastor, evangelist, and apologist, and he's currently working on a Master of Divinity at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. He has appeared several times on the Apologetics Marathon hosted by the Trinity Channel Radio Christ Truth Matters and spoken at the National Conference on Christian Apologetics. One of his greatest desires is to see the church equipped and ready to defend the message of Jesus Christ with gentleness and respect, as spoken in 1 Peter 3:15. And he and his wife and Alicia live in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. So, Daryl, welcome, and thank you for joining the debate.
Well, thank you for being willing to debate, Keith. Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't done a lot of debates, but this seemed like one that was worth engaging in. And then for those who don't know who I am, my name is Keith Giles. I was also licensed and ordained as a minister of the gospel about 28 years ago, although I left the pulpit about 11 years ago, as I say, to follow Jesus by starting a house church where no one takes a salary and 100% of the offering goes to help the poor in our community. I have been a guest on several other podcasts and radio programs in the past, including John Fugelsang's Sirius XM radio show. I'm the author of a couple of books, Jesus Untangled, Crucifying Our Politics to Pledge Allegiance to the Lamb, and most recently, the book Jesus Unbound, Liberating the Word of God from the Bible. And I also co-host a podcast with two other friends of mine called the Heretic Happy Hour podcast. I live in Orange County with my wife, Wendy, and our two sons. And I believe that's enough of the introduction. So Daryl and I decided ahead of time that we were going to allow Daryl to go first, and we'll each have 20 minutes to give an opening statement on the topic of Islam. Is it a violent religion or a peaceful religion? And then after we each have had our 20-minute opening statement, that'll be followed by a 10-minute rebuttal. And then that will probably end part one of the podcast, of the recording. And then we will do a part two where we will then do a cross-examination and do our closing statements. And I think that's our plan. So, Daryl, are you ready?
I am, yes.
All right. Well, yeah, I guess you're on. You can go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you, Keith. All right. Well, the thesis that I will be defending, as Keith has already said, is basically that Islam is inherently violent. That's not my opinion, not something that I learned from a professor. It's just reality according to the Islamic sources themselves. Now, just to clarify my position, let me say that I absolutely love Muslims. And I've often said from the pulpit that I would rather talk to Muslims than to Christians, because most Muslims, at least Muslims that are hungry for the truth, that is, I would rather talk to them than a Christian, because they need to hear the gospel of the real Jesus, the good news of Jesus Christ of the Bible. And I long to see Muslims come to Christ and embrace the real Injil. But this debate is about Islam, which is the religion. There's a difference there. Muslims are the adherents to the religion. I can love Muslims and hate Islam. I can hate the political religious ideology that holds so many people captive. And let me say that, a Muslim can misrepresent Islam just as a Christian can misrepresent Christianity. So it does no good to look at what this particular group of Muslims are doing in this part of the country at this place or this particular time. I'm talking about Islam, the religion itself. Islam means submission and really defines what it means to be a Muslim, one who submits. So again, I just want to make sure that it's clear that my desire is not to belittle Muslims, that I am focused here today on talking about the religion of Islam as inherently violent as defined by Muhammad himself. Okay? So we must ask, what are the sources which define this religion? And I would like to suggest that there are only three, and that is the Quran, the Hadith collections, and the biography of Muhammad. All other sources reference these three in some way. Okay, and it's often summed up by referring to the book and the man. So the book is the Quran, and the man is Muhammad. Muhammad is said to be the final prophet. He is the seal of the prophets, according to Islam. And in other words, he's the final prophet. There's no one to come after him. There's no further revelation to come from any other prophet of God. Muhammad kind of seals everything off, and what he has to say is a settled matter according to Islam. So there's no such thing as Islam without the Quran and Muhammad, just as there's no such thing as Christianity apart from the Bible and Jesus. And I would also like to point out, perhaps some of our listeners don't know this, but there are a lot of similarities between Islam and Christianity, but there's some very, very major differences as well, such as the fact that there's no such thing as a personal relationship with Allah in Islam. He's completely and utterly transcendent. He's basically unknowable. The Quran, there's the 99 names of Allah, and the Quran is supposed to be the word of Allah, but it only reveals His will. It only reveals what Allah does. It doesn't reveal what He is or who He is. It doesn't speak of His character. And so why is that important? It's important because Muslims have no choice but to look at Muhammad. Surah 33:21, and a surah is just a chapter, again, if some of our listeners don't know that. But Surah 33:21 says that Muhammad demonstrated good examples in all aspects of life. Allah says, "You have indeed in the apostle of Allah a beautiful pattern of conduct for anyone whose hope is in Allah." 91 times we find something similar to this in the Quran. So a Muslim is a Muslim only so far as they have emulated the Prophet Muhammad. Salvation. I mean, if you're going to become a Muslim and you're going to enter into this belief system, salvation is promised by Allah only if you follow Muhammad. That's found in Surah 3:31. Anyone who becomes a Muslim must confess what's called the Shahada, which is the Islamic confession of faith. Maybe could be compared to the sinner's prayer. I don't know if that's a good comparison or not, but in order to become a Muslim, you must say La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadin Rasulullah, that is, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. So these two are so connected. I mean, even if we go back and we look at these three sources that we have, the Quran, the Hadith collections, and the biography of Muhammad, we can see that Islam is defined more by Muhammad. 2/3 of it is Muhammad, and 1/3 is the Quran, the Word of Allah. So this is a very, very important matter when we're talking about what is Islam, what defines Islam. And so now we must turn our attention, I think, to Muhammad himself and ask, what kind of person was this man? What are some of the things that he said, and what are some of the things that he did? Let me get my Quran open here, and I'm just for the moment, I'm going to focus on Surah 9, 29. Surah 9 is said to be one of the final revelations that come down to Muhammad from the angel Gabriel, and perhaps I should explain that a little bit. But when Muhammad was in Mecca, he was very much a peaceful man. You'll find a lot of verses in the Quran that suggest peace, such as there's no compulsion in religion, which is perhaps one of the most quoted verses referencing peace. But Surah 9 abrogates that verse and many, many more, because it's the final revelation from Allah. So you have these contradictory verses that are really problematic, and they are explained by the doctrine of abrogation. And Surah chapter 9 is pretty much agreed upon by most, if not all, scholars within Islam, that this is the last and final, most authoritative chapter in the Quran. So Surah 9:29 says, according to Muhammad, according to the Allah of Islam, fight those who believe not in God nor in the last day. Now, anybody who has had a conversation of any kind with a Muslim, you may quote this verse and get a number of different responses, and perhaps two of the most common is, there's a context to that. Well, sure there is, but the context is very, very vague, and it can be basically interpreted any way a Muslim wants to. And so notice that it doesn't say fight those who attack you, defend yourself if necessary. There's really nothing here about some kind of war going on. It just says fight those who believe not like you do. So this kind of sets Islam up against every other belief system in the world as a violent religion. I'm not sure how you could hold any other position. Fight those who believe not in God, nor in the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by God and his apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book. Now, the phrase "the people of the book" is primarily focused on Jews and Christians. So this one verse right here is clearly directed at Jews and Christians. We kind of have a broad category of those who believe not in God, and then we move to more of a focus on Jews and Christians. And we see really that the options for a Jew or a Christian who is under Islamic law or finds himself uh, in a position where they are under the rule of Sharia law. They have basically the options that are listed here. It says, um, speaking of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya, which is basically a poll tax, okay? And willing submission and feel themselves subdued. So you either pay this jizya or you lose your life. And this is, I'm reading out of the Yusuf Ali translation of the Quran. And Yusuf, he comments on this, the jizya tax. And he basically says that those who did not accept Islam, but were willing to live under the protection of Islam, basically goes on to say exactly what I just said, that you either pay this jizya, accept Islam, or you die. Those are your three choices. And historically, at least from a Islamic historical perspective, we know that this has happened many, many times in the Sunnah, the biography, and in the Hadith collections of Islam. We have many stories recording how Muhammad and his men killed the infidels who would not submit to Islam. So, that's just one verse. There are many, many, many more. It's really difficult to figure out what part of, what violent part of Islam that I want to talk about. There's, you could talk about apostasy. It seems to be pretty clear that if somebody confesses the Shahada and becomes a Muslim, and then they later change their mind and leave Islam, Muhammad clearly said that they should be killed. There is the fact that Muhammad and his men took slaves, especially sex slaves. There's the idea of deception in Islam. We hear a lot about Muslims, saying one thing but believing another. A commentary or commenter, Ibn Kathir, he said, and by the way, you can find this online. You don't have to take my word for it. www.tafsir.com, TAFSIR.com. Ibn Kathir said that we smile in the face of some people, although our hearts curse them. So you have this problem of deception as well, and that's not to say that. That's certainly not to say that every Muslim is out to deceive us, and we can't trust any Muslim in the United States or any. I'm not saying that. I want to make it clear that I'm saying this is what Islam teaches. Perhaps there are many, many Muslims out there who don't know this. I know for a fact that there are many Muslims out there that don't know what the Quran itself teaches. Many of them have memorized the entire Quran in Arabic, but they have no clue what it even means. They're just repeating sounds that they've memorized. So I'm not saying that every Muslim is out to deceive us, but I am saying that one could easily look at the teachings of Muhammad, look at the teachings found in the Quran and the Sunnah, and condone deception. And that's, there's a number of other verses and references that I could point to support that idea. We see over and over again too that just in case by this point somebody is wondering just how important it is to follow the example of Muhammad. I want to emphasize that again. I mean, I've got 3 pages of verses here from the Quran that really say the same thing over and over and over again. It's Surah 3:31. If you really love Allah, then follow me. That is the Prophet Muhammad. Surah 3:32 says, obey Allah and the Messenger, Muhammad. Surah 4:13, whoever obeys Allah and his messenger will be admitted to gardens under which rivers flow in paradise. So you can't even enter into the Islamic paradise unless you're obedient to Allah and the Prophet Muhammad. And again, there's much, much more that I could point to as far as violence. I'm a little curious to see which way Keith is going to go with this, but apostasy, how Muslims treat non-Muslims, how do they treat thieves, how do they treat women. I've already said that they condone slavery and the taking of sex slaves. You'll find that over and over in the Quran. So these things are recorded in the Islamic sources themselves. And I'm not sure how much time I have left here, Keith. So if you...
I think you've got about 2 minutes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I hadn't heard a peep out of you. Just wanted to make sure we were still recording. All right. Let me go back to how Muslims and non-Muslims interact just a little bit, if I could, in my closing statements. Surah 61 says, "Oh, you who believe," that is, those of you who are Muslims, those of you who follow the path of Islam. It says, "Take not mine enemies and your friends and yours as friends or protectors, offering them your love, even though they have rejected the truth that has come to you and have, on the contrary, driven out the prophet and yourselves from your homes, simply because you believe in Allah, your Lord." Surah 41, 31, 34 says, something very, very similar. "We are your protectors in this life, and in the hereafter therein shall you have all that your soul shall desire. Therein you have all that you have asked for." Talks about, "I am of those who bow to Islam, goodness and evil, and between whom thee was hatred become as it is." This translation of the Quran is a little bit difficult to read. Perhaps I'll open that back up in my Yusuf Ali translation when we come back. But I'll turn it over to you now, Keith.
Okay. Thank you so much, Daryl. And you were right on time there, so that was great. So, yeah, thank you so much, Daryl. And so I'm going to be taking this other position. And I think to start off, before I get into the meat of the question, I would like to address sort of the question that we're addressing in the debate itself. The underlying assumption of our debate topic is Islam a religion of peace or a religion of violence? The underlying assumption in that question is that Islam is violent, and the question therefore also assumes that by comparison, our religion, the one that Daryl and I are equally part of, which is Christianity, is not violent. In other words, if we are going to, as members of one religion, examine a different religion than our own and determine that that religion is violent, I think even the words of Jesus should reflect back to both Daryl and I in this conversation to say, before you point out the speck in someone else's eye, perhaps you should look at the log or the plank in your own eye. And unfortunately, when we turn the gaze back upon ourselves, if we look at ourselves in a mirror, as we're often urged to do in the scriptures and our own scriptures, we would have to admit that Judaism and Christianity are both historically violent religions, and sometimes extremely so. In fact, just recently, a data analyst and research marketer named Tom Anderson turned this misconception that many Christians have, the idea that Islam is a violent religion, turned it upon its head, because what they did was they did a study of both the Old Testament scriptures, the New Testament scriptures, and the Quran, and looked at all three books and examined all three books for violent language and violent imagery. And what they found was that approximately 5.3% of the text of the Old Testament scriptures refers to destruction and killing and genocide and things like this. The Quran clocked in at just 2.1%, so 50% less violence than what we have in the Old Testament scriptures. And even the New Testament was higher than the Quran at 2.8%. So if we were going to compare the Old Covenant scriptures, the New Covenant scriptures, and the Quran to one another and rank them according to which text is more violent, the most violent text would be the Hebrew scriptures. The second most violent text would be the New Testament scriptures, and the least, at least in that comparison of those scriptures, the least violent would be the Quran. And so I think we as Christians need to consider that as we are sitting here and pulling up scriptures from the Quran and saying, well, look at this violent scripture in the Quran. Well, the fact is we could find twice as many violent scriptures in the Old Covenant scriptures, especially, like Numbers 31, verses 17 through 18, where God says to his people, now therefore kill every male among the little ones, these are children, and kill every woman who has known a man intimately, but all of the young girls who have not known a man intimately, spare for yourselves. And I think even as my friend Daryl was referring to the fact that in the Quran there's references to taking slaves and women as sex slaves. Well, this passage suggests exactly that. In Deuteronomy 20, verse 16 through 17, we again have God commanding his people to go into the cities of all those that are around them, to strike them down, and that they would leave alive nothing that breathes. In Deuteronomy 2:34, it says that God says, at God's instructions, the Israelites utterly destroyed the men, the women, and the children, leaving none to remain. Again, in Deuteronomy 2:33 through 36, we read that he says, and we took all the cities at that time and utterly destroyed the men and the women and the little children of every city, and we left none to remain. Now, I don't have time to read all of them, but there are many, many scriptures like this, where God commands in the Old Covenant scriptures, in the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures. And what's fascinating is the commands are often to kill men and to kill women and to kill the old and to kill the young, even a warning not to show mercy to the little ones, to the children and to the toddlers, to even split open the pregnant bellies of women who are pregnant, and then to go and kill all of the animals as well, the oxen and the sheep and the donkey, with the edge of the sword, as it says in Joshua 6:21 through 23. What's fascinating about that is that what we see in the Quran and in the writings of Muhammad is that Muhammad gave a very opposite command. Muhammad told his followers that when they go into battle, they are not to harm the women, they are not to harm the elderly, they are not to harm the children or the animals or even trees or plants that are growing. So we actually see, if anything, in comparison, Muhammad showing more mercy than what we see shown in the Old Covenant scriptures. Now, I want to also say in defense of Islam, again, I'm not a Muslim, and I'm only someone who has studied it, and I've also spent a lot of time with people who are of the Muslim faith. And here's some of the things that I've learned about Islam. Islam is a religion which teaches nonviolence. According to the Quran, God does not love fasad, or violence. And this is clearly expressed in verse 205 of the second surah. Basically, fasad is an action which results in the disruption of the entire social system, anything that causes losses in terms of life and property. We can also say with certainty that Allah in the Quran loves nonviolence. And this is supported by other statements in the Quran where we are told that, in fact, peace is one of the names of Allah in Surah 59:23. Those who seek to please God are assured, or those who seek to please Allah, are assured in verse 5 of the 16th surah that they will be guided by Allah to the paths of peace. Paradise, which is the final destination of those who are among the followers of Allah, as referred to in the Quran. Paradise is called the home of peace. And in one of the more famous passages from the Quran is Surah 532 that says, if anyone kills a person, it would be as if he killed all mankind. So strictly speaking, however, let me just back up a little bit here and say something about this, even the idea of determining whether or not Islam is a peaceful or a violent religion. Strictly speaking, it's no more correct to say that Islam is peaceful than it is to say that Islam is violent, because the texts and traditions on which any faith's practice are based upon are open to many interpretations. We can look dispassionately at the holy book, and just, again, if we're looking for violent verses, whether we're looking at the Old Testament, the New Testament, or the Quran, we will find plenty of violent verses. However, if we're looking for verses that speak about peace and harmony and love and forgiveness, no matter which book we're looking at, we can find those verses as well. Also, the question of whether or not a religion like Islam or Christianity is violent or not violent also must be determined by the people who are following the religion, because, of course, a religion by itself is just a belief system. It can't be violent or non-violent. It's like saying Chinese is violent. No, Chinese is not violent. It's a language that must be spoken by human beings. And Islam and Christianity and Judaism are belief systems that must be practiced by human beings. So to determine whether or not a religion like Islam is peaceful or violent, you must look at the people. Well, we know there's over 1 billion people with a B on planet Earth right now who are following Islam. And I would argue that 99% of them are not violent people. Can I find some people who claim to follow Islam who are violent? Well, yes, I can. But I could also find violent people who say that they follow the Prince of Peace, who is Jesus Christ, and they are also very violent. And so in the same way, is it fair to say, if I can point to violent Christians, therefore, and I can point to violent verses in the Christian book, the holy book, therefore, my conclusion is proven that Christianity is a violent religion? Is that fair to say? And I would say if it's not fair to say to Christianity, perhaps it's not fair to say to Islam as well. A man named Robin Wright, who is an apologist for Islam, made a point of saying that mining the Quran, he says, for incendiary quotes is essentially pointless. Religions evolve, and there is usually enough ambiguity in their founding scriptures to let them evolve in any direction. And he says, and I would agree, if Osama bin Laden were a Christian and he wanted to destroy the World Trade Center, he would simply cite Jesus' rampage against the money changers in the temple to justify that action. But if he didn't want to destroy the World Trade Center, he could instead stress the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says we should turn the other cheek and love our enemies. The point is, if you are looking for something, if you are violent, you can find justification for violence, whether you're looking at the Bible or you're looking at the Quran. If you're wanting to be a person of peace, you can find justifications for peace, whether you're looking at the Bible or the Quran. And now when it comes to this idea, this question again of, is Christianity a peaceful religion? Even those of us who are Christians who would want to say, well, of course, Christianity is a Christian religion. Well, as I mentioned, I can point to many people who claim to be followers of Christ who are terrorists. Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City, was an active member of something called the Christian Identity Movement. And he did so, he blew up that building because he had certain beliefs about the end times. Dylan Roof, a Christian young man who was a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, traveled to Charleston, South Carolina in 2015 and shot 9 black churchgoers because he said he wanted to kill black people. Mark David Chapman, the man who shot John Lennon, did so because he was a huge fan of the Beatles before he became a Christian. Once he became a Christian, it bothered him that John Lennon had once said that the Beatles were more famous than Jesus, and he felt that John Lennon was a blasphemer. And the reason he says that he killed John Lennon was because John Lennon was guilty of blasphemy, and he shot him to death in 1980. Eric Robert Rudolph, who carried out the Centennial Olympic Park bombing in 1996, before that also blew up an abortion clinic and a lesbian nightclub, again because of his Christian beliefs. Robert Louis Deere, in November of 2015, was responsible for the Colorado Springs Planned Parenthood shooting, in which 3 people were killed and 9 were injured. And at the time, he also praised another Christian terrorist group called the Army of God, saying that their attacks on abortion clinics were also God's work. In 1996, 3 men, Charles Barbie, Robert Berry, and Jay Morrell, were charged with 2 bank robberies and bombings at banks in Spokane, and also a Planned Parenthood office in Washington State. They were members also of the Christian Identity group, and they believed that God wanted them to carry out violent attacks. And then just recently, Mark Anthony Condit was responsible for setting off a series of bombs in Austin, Texas. That was this past year. And he's a 23-year-old man who set off a series of bombs in Austin, Texas. And he was part of a conservative religious survivalist group called the Righteous Invasion of Truth. And they had Bible studies. They had outdoor groups for homeschooled children. They provided monthly activities for Christian children, such as archery and water balloon fights, and as well as training on how to use firearms. And so I could go on again if I had time, and if you're curious, I would even recommend if you think that's an exhaustive list. I encourage you to just Google or go to Wikipedia and search Christian terrorism, and you'll find a very long list of them. And those are just examples in America. I could also go and look in Africa at Joseph Kony and the Lord Resistance Army. I could look in Australia, a guy named Peter James Knight on July 16th of 2001 went into, again, a fertility clinic and an abortion provider with a rifle with the intention of killing 15 people. And he did so because of his belief in the Bible and in Christianity. In the Central African Republic there in 2014, there have been forced conversions by a Christian group called Anti-Balaka. They have killed Muslims. They have forced them to convert to Christianity at gunpoint. And we see this happening also in India and in China and on and on. And I could keep on going, but I'm going to stop there. According to an FBI analysis of every United States terrorist attack on American soil, between 1980 and 2005, 94% were carried out by someone who was not a Muslim. And in fact, between 2001 and 2015, more Americans were killed by homegrown right-wing white extremists and many times white supremacists who believed in Christian identity as a religion. More of them were killed by them than by Islamic terrorists. And this was according to a study by New America, a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. And even since Trump took office, more Americans have been killed by white American men with no connection to Islam than anywhere else. So even just back in 2017, a 64-year-old man, as we know, went to Las Vegas and opened fire on a crowd of 22,000 people and killed 50 of them and wounded 200. In August, a white 20-year-old Nazi sympathizer from Ohio ran his car into some anti-racist protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he killed a woman and injured 19 more. In June, a 66-year-old white man from Illinois shot at a Republican Congress members during a baseball practice and wounded several people. In March, a 28-year-old white man from Baltimore traveled to New York City with the explicit aim of killing black men, and he stabbed a 66-year-old man to death and was charged with terrorism by the New York State authorities. In May, a 35-year-old white man from Oregon named Jeremy Joseph Christian began harassing Muslim teenagers on a train in Portland, and when 2 other men stepped up to protect these women, he stabbed them both to death. So now I say all that to say that I believe Christians, especially in America, sort of have a blind spot. There was a survey done recently by PRRI that's found that white evangelical Protestant Christians are the most likely to disown Christian terrorists who claim to be acting in the name of Christianity. But they are they're among the least likely to say the same about a terrorist who says that they're a Muslim. In other words, Christians tend to believe terrorists who say, I'm doing this in the name of Allah. But when someone says, I'm doing this in the name of Christ, or I'm doing this in the name of Christianity, white Protestants don't accept that. They don't believe that. And yet, even though this flies in the face of all the evidence that we have. I must also point out, in the question of whether or not Christianity or Christians are violent, that we should remember, especially as Americans, that at one point in American history, almost half of the Christians in America went to war with other Christians over the power to own Black people as slaves. And when that failed, they reverted to organized terrorism. My friend Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who's a Christian author, powerfully recounts in his book, Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from the Slaveholder Religion, that in the era of Reconstruction following the Civil War, it was interrupted quite often by Christian terrorist attacks, such, for example, the Colfax Massacre that took place on Easter Sunday in 1873. And again, we have to understand that the Civil War was the bloodiest battle, not only on American soil, but really up until some of the more recent wars. The Civil War was the bloodiest battle. So in other words, I think 1,264,000 American soldiers have died in total in the nation's wars, but 620,000 of them were in the Civil War. And so it's only recently, that, like in the Vietnam War and other wars have eclipsed that number. But again, understand the Civil War was a war where Christians killed other Christians over a disagreement about what the Bible had to say about slavery. So there are almost twice as many terrorist incidents by right-wing extremists, which tend to be Christian, as by Islamic extremists in the United States from over the last 8 years. And again, these are according to many studies that are done, one most recently by the National Institute for Investigative Fund and the Center for Investigative Reporting. So in wrapping this up here in my last few minutes, Christians, I believe, need to be more concerned with their own violence before we start to worry about the violence of other religions. What's more, the violence of a religion or religious book is no indication of the violence of a person within that religion. Of course, to proclaim that Christians are violent simply because their Bible is filled with violence is not fair. But in the same way, to proclaim that Islam is a violent religion is to accuse a peaceful Muslim man or woman of something that they have not been guilty of. Islam is a peaceful religion, as those who practice it faithfully, and out of the 1.8 billion Muslims in the world today, as I said, over 90% of them are peaceful. But can we say the same of Christians? Let's not just all judge everyone on the actions of a few people. Or as Jesus would say, let's treat others as we would want to be treated ourselves. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Keith.
And so now we have some time to do a rebuttal. And so if you want, I guess you can, do you want me to ask you questions since you went first?
We're going to do the 10-minute rebuttal. I'll respond to what you just said.
Yes.
And then I'll turn it back over to you for 10 minutes if that's all right. Okay. All right. Let me get my clock going here so I can kind of keep an eye on it. All right. So, heard a lot from Keith there, and most of it come back to pointing to Christianity as violent. And with all due respect, I would say that that's not our debate here today. And it comes across really as a red herring. I don't know. You seem to be avoiding the topic, but I'll be happy to debate Old Testament violence, slavery in the Old Testament. Any of those things that you talked about, I'll be glad to debate that at another time. But you don't judge a religion by how somebody misunderstands it. And the point that I made in my opening statements was precisely that Islam is inherently violent. The Quran and the Sunnah explicitly teach violence. That's not the case with Christianity. It's not the case at all. We don't have a problem with Christians flying planes into buildings. We don't have a problem with Christians making bombs out of pressure cookers. We don't have a problem with Christians running a vehicle through a crowd of people. It's not taught in our scriptures, and Islam can't say that. And that's the difference between my perspective and your perspective. You quoted the Bible over and over and over again. But I just tried to write down a few things that you said about Islam, and you made the comment that Islam said somewhere, I didn't get the reference, but it said not to harm women and children. I would love to hear that reference again, even if you give it to me later. But Muhammad said, was asked about this very question, and his response was, "They are among them." In other words, it's okay because they are among our enemies. Kill them. You spoke of the Islamic paradise. Muhammad said paradise is under the shade of swords. You quoted a verse out of the Quran that talked about if somebody killed a human being, it would be as if he killed all of mankind. If you look at the context of that verse that you quoted, it's speaking of the Israelites. It's not speaking to Muslims. Read the next verse too. It condones violence. The next verse after what you just quoted. You talked about many interpretations of the Quran. And I explained that by way of abrogation, the doctrine of abrogation. This is pretty much, again, a settled matter. You want to know what Islam's like? You don't even have to read the entire Quran. Just sit down and read Surah chapter 9, and you will understand, if you can read, that Islam is inherently violent, the religion itself. And this is, again, this is not my opinion. This is a settled matter among the Islamic schools of jurisprudence. You can look at there's what's called the Reliance of the Traveler, which is a classical manual of Islamic sacred law. This book was given the stamp of approval of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt, which is basically the oldest and most prestigious university in the world connected to Islam. And here's basically what it says. It forbids the use of philosophy. So anybody who is trying to reason in a way that contradicts the Quran and the Sunnah, this is forbidden by Islamic sacred law. You can find that on page 868 of the Reliance of the Traveler. It says also on page 21 that belief in the Quran and Sunnah is obligatory. You don't have a choice in this matter. This is, Muslims are not sitting down somewhere and having a Quran study, looking at different verses and saying, what does this mean to you? Like so many good and well-meaning Christians may do. This is a settled matter. And I would challenge you, again, to name one specific school of Islamic jurisprudence that condones peace between Muslims and non-Muslims. It's not there. This Reliance of the Traveler also says basically that the gates of ijtihad are closed. Ijtihad speaks of independent reasoning, which is what I just spoke of. The Encyclopedia of Islam confirms the same thing. And I'm, all of this I'm speaking of Sunni Islam, which is 80 to 90% of the Muslim world. So Muslims are not allowed by Islamic law to study the Quran and the Sunnah and arrive at a conclusion that contradicts the Quran and the Sunnah. This is a settled matter. So again, I point you back to the sources which defined Islam. You spoke a lot about Christians and about some of the history of America. That doesn't define Christianity. Even if 99% of the professing Christians in the world condone violence, that would say nothing to Christianity. Jesus didn't condone it. Again, if we look back at Muhammad, we see exactly the opposite. Muhammad condoned violence wherever you turn, just about in the Quran, over and over again. The Quran says more about unbelievers than it does practically believers. let me just give a few more Quranic verses in my last few minutes here. Surah 2:216 in the Quran says, fighting is prescribed for you. 3:15, soon shall we cast terror into the heart of the unbelievers. Now, again, if Allah is speaking in a context that is defensive, somebody has attacked a Muslim, that's not what we find here. He specifically speaks to unbelievers over and over and over again. If you do not believe in Islam, if you do not submit to Islam, cast fear into their hearts, cast terror into their hearts. 8:12 says the same thing. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. And perhaps you're wondering, again, to go back to, well, this, some Muslims will say, well, this is just for the time of Muhammad. Well, the Quran addresses that as well. How long should Muslims do this? Is this just a one-time thing that happened in the 7th century with Muhammad and some people? No. The Quran says very clearly again, fight with them until there is no more persecution, and religion should be only for Allah. One of the things that we encounter a lot as Christian apologists with Muslims is, the idea that jihad is a spiritual struggle. Jihad means struggle. Well, this again does not correspond with the teaching of Islam. Surah 9:20 says, those who believe and have left their homes and striven with their wealth and their lives in Allah's way are of much greater worth in Allah's sight. So this is clearly speaking of a physical jihad. Muhammad condoned the taking of booty, the taking of someone else's possessions in this jihad. A couple of other verses that confirm that jihad is physical. Surah 9:41, go forth light armed and heavy armed, and strive with your wealth and your lives in the way of Allah. Strive, jihad. Surah 9:88, but the messenger and those who believe with him strive and fight with their wealth and their person. All these verses that I'm quoting are using the Arabic word jihad. So we find this over and over and over again in the Quran. And Muhammad said, you find the same thing in the Hadith collection, Sahih Bukhari, which is one of the most authoritative hadiths that there is in Sunni Islam. Sahih means sound. Sahih Bukhari says the hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, "O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him." I think my time is up, so I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Daryl. Yeah, I wanted to respond to a couple of things that you said just recently, but I want to go back to something you said in your opening statement as well. You quoted Surah 9:29, which says, fight those who do not believe in Allah. And the entire thing says, or in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and his messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who were given the scripture. Fight until they give the jizya willingly while they are humbled. And you quoted that as an example of example of Muhammad speaking as if now he's sanctioning the killing of Christians and Jews across the board. I would just want to offer the same kind of thing we would ask of somebody who was not a Christian, who quoted a verse either in the Old Testament or in the New Testament out of context. We would say, well, hold on a second. We need to look at the context of when this was written, who was he writing to, what was happening at the time. And what was happening at the time that Muhammad wrote this Surah 9:29 was that they were getting ready to be invaded by the Byzantine Empire, which at the time was the largest and most powerful army on the planet. And so what he was urging them to do in context was to vigorously defend themselves against those who were about to attack them. And so again, I understand that in the language itself, if I just only read the sentence, then I would come across saying, there you go. He's telling every Muslim everywhere at all times to kill Christians and Jews. But in the context, what he's saying is we are about to be invaded by these people who are Christians and Jews and basically Gentiles as compared to them. And what he's urging them to do is it is a defensive verse. It is saying we need to fight and defend ourselves from these people who are coming, this great army that is coming against us. I also wanted to talk about a couple other statements that you made. In my opening statement, Daryl, I listed, I think, about 6 or 7 specific people who identified themselves as Christians, and because of their Christian faith and their beliefs, their different Christian beliefs, they did drive cars into crowds of people. They did set off bombs and kill people. They did fire into crowds of people and kill people. And so to say that Christians don't have a problem with those things is inaccurate. If you can, again, I encourage anybody to just go to Wikipedia, go to Google, type in Christian terrorist, Christian terrorism, and you will see a very long list of people who are in the name of Christ committing atrocities and violence. Now, of course, Daryl and I would agree. We would say those people are misguided. They are not truly following the Prince of Peace. Jesus is not in favor of those things, and Jesus would never want someone who said, I follow Christ, to pick up a gun and kill or shoot someone or drive a car into someone or fly a plane into a building or set off a bomb or do all these horrible things that are being done in the name of Christ. But it doesn't change the fact that it is being done in the name of Christ by people who identify themselves as Christians. And I also would say, if I talk to a Muslim, and I have done this, I've had Muslims in my home. I've had Muslim people come and visit our church. I've had them over to my house for dinner. I've gone to other people's homes where they've been there. I've even sat and read the gospel with them and talked to them about Jesus, who they call Isa, and talked a lot about what we have in common with them. And here's what I've noticed in all the different people I've talked to who are Muslim. Not a single one of them wanted to kill me. Not a single one of them was violent. Not a single one of them showed any desire to do violence to Christians in general, to me specifically, or to anybody who was an American citizen. These were the most gentle, kind, loving people. In fact, they're just like me and you. They love their mom and dad. They love their brothers and sisters. They love their children. They love their neighbors. They want to live at peace with everybody else around them. And again, there's over 1.9 billion Muslims in this world. If they were as violent as you're trying to say that they are, I think most of us would be dead by now. What you're seeing is, yes, some people who say they follow Islam and Muhammad, yes, they have been violent. But is that a fair assessment of the religion to judge the entire religion on the actions of a few? You also mentioned that you said you didn't believe that there were any branches of Islam or schools of Islam or schools of thought within Islam that are in favor of promoting peaceful relationships or peaceful dialogue with non-Muslims. Well, I know that, again, that isn't the truth. That's not the case. I have a good friend who started something called the Muslim Christian Alliance. And there are many imams who are members of that, who are very eager to sit down with Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and even with non-believers, with atheists, to sit down and have conversations, to have dialogue, to not just talk to one another and to try to prove to one another that we're right and they're wrong, but to listen to one another. And yes, even the Muslims, the imams and the Muslim people are willing to listen. Again, do you have some Muslims who are unwilling to listen? Yes, absolutely. You also have some Christians who are also unwilling to listen to anybody else as well, who would not sit down at the table with a Muslim or with a Jew. But that doesn't mean every Christian is that way, just because some of them are that way. And you mentioned, that Jesus did not condone violence, and I absolutely agree with you. I'm actually someone who believes in nonviolence. I believe that no follower of Christ should ever pick up a gun or a weapon and kill anybody for any reason. But Christians do practice violence. In fact, if we look at history, we see that starting at the time of Constantine, Christians are really good at killing other Christians. Christians have taken up the sword at the time of Constantine, within a generation of Constantine's conversion, Christians went from saying, I have no king but Christ, to saying, I do have a king, and it's Christ, and it's also the Caesar. It's also the Roman Empire. They pledged allegiance to the empire. They dropped the cross. They picked up the sword. They began killing other Christians who they disagreed with over issues of doctrine. And then we ended up with the Inquisitions. We ended up burning martyrs at the stake for hundreds of years. And as I mentioned, even in the American Civil War, there were Christian men and women killing other Christian men and women over this disagreement of how to understand what the Bible taught about slavery. The history is filled with evidence that Christians are the kind of people. Christians do have a problem with violence. And I think it's wrong. And I think we should repent of it. And I think we should have nothing to do with it. I think if we're going to follow Jesus, the Prince of Peace, we should put his teachings into practice, as it says in Isaiah, beat our swords into plowshares and study war no more. He is the Prince of Peace. He taught us to love our enemy, turn the other cheek, bless those who curse us, do good to those who hate us. But again, Christians are doing violence today. They have been doing violence ever since the time of Constantine, and they're doing violence right now. And so, again, to say that, well, because there are a few examples of Muslims who have done violence in the name of Allah, and to say, well, but to pretend as if we don't have a similar problem. We do have a similar problem. There are people who are, in the name of Jesus, killing other people, taking up weapons and hurting and killing other people, not just in Africa, not just in India, but also even here in America. And then again, you also mentioned how the Quran, has these specific instructions about taking booty in war, taking people as slaves, and all kinds of things. But these echo the verses that we read in the Old Testament scriptures. In other words, the fact that those scriptures exist in the holy book of a certain religion does not in itself mean that everyone involved in that religion is eager to carry those things out. Most Christians I know, which I would say would also be equal to most Muslims that I've met, are not looking for excuses to take violent verses in their holy books and putting them into practice. Again, maybe it's because, as you said, a lot of Muslims don't even really know exactly what is taught in the Quran. But I think you and I would agree a whole lot of Christians also have no idea what is really taught in their Bibles either. This is a problem with all religions. And it might be a good idea if we all did learn what our religions teach and what they believe. But again, my concern is for Christians. And my concern is that Christians not cast stones at other religions and say, you guys are violent, as if we're not, because we are. And we definitely do. As Jesus said, we have a giant plank in our own eye that I think we need to deal with that first. If we could truly become a religion that is peaceful, that is loving across the board to a man, to say, if you follow Christ, you may not commit violence in any way. I would say personally, that would go even to not being involved in the military, not taking up arms and going to kill someone in another country who might be your brother or sister in Christ, who that Jesus could appear to you and say, why do you kick against the pricks? Because when you harm these people who are my body, it hurts me as well. And that's what we're doing when we take up arms and go to war and kill people who are our brothers, potentially our brothers and sisters in Christ, or potentially non-believers who frankly need to live long enough to hear the gospel. We should be bringing them the gospel, not violence at the end of a weapon. And that's my time. Thank you, Daryl. And so this is going to end part one of the debate. We've been talking now for an hour and about 3 minutes or 4 minutes. So we're going to stop here, and then we will return for the second half of the debate, where we'll do some more discussion with each other and some Q&A, and then we'll do our closing statements.